So, hello, we're ready. Sixth time that I have been able to participate in the ICAA meeting, and I'm very pleased to be here once again. And now we will build on what has been said this morning, partially, and this environment that is growing and in a context of fear and rejection, and which is something that is happening also in the political arena. And well, we will have the opportunity to discuss this. We had originally three participants. Unfortunately, Dr. William Vega from USC was unable to join us because he fell sick yesterday, and he was not able to travel. So we will begin with the first presentation by Nestor Rodriguez in behalf of a team in which Jacqueline Hagen and David Leal participate as well, from the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Texas Medical Branch, talking about aging environment of fear. Nestor, the floor is yours.
Self-time myself, so when you're up here, as all of you know, you tend to lose sense of time. I do. So start. Okay. First, I want to thank everyone who put this wonderful conference together and invited me. I'm very glad to be here. My paper is going to look at two things: aging environment, which is populations in the aging process, and then this concept and condition of fear brought about by relatively new immigration policies that restrict or limit immigration. And as soon as I figure out how to change this, which is the one to change the slides? That one? Okay, great. So let's just get to the paper. Here's the paper's thesis. Here's my argument. Restrictive immigration policies implemented since the mid-1990s have created fear and stress in immigrant environments that negatively affect the quality of life for older immigrants age 50 and older. It negatively affects the quality of life for many immigrants, much younger than that, but in my paper I'm looking at older immigrants. Notice that I say older and not old, okay? I myself am over 50, way over 50. So older immigrants age 50 and older. So that's my argument. Okay, so I'm particularly interested in two statutes passed by Congress in 1996, but not solely, not exclusively. One is IRA, that's what sociologists call it. And I put it in red because it is a law that has done many dramatic things that impact immigrants, especially the undocumented, but also legal immigrants and even citizens of the U.S. who are married to children of non-citizens or whatever. So IRA stands for Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. In just a few months apart, Congress also passed PRORA, which was Personal Responsibility Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. And so IRA made it a lot easier to deport people. In 1995, before the passage of IRA, the government deported about 50,000 migrants back to their country. Just a few years ago, that number has now reached from 50,000 to over 400,000, right? And it's primarily because of this law that makes it easier to deport people. PRORA limited access to health care, Medicaid, et cetera, to immigrants to some extent. This placed older migrants at risk. IRA placed older migrants at risk for arrest, detention, and deportation. Created instability, fear, and tension in households that support older migrants, and restricted access to health care for migrants, older migrants. IRA restricted all access to health care for undocumented migrants, only with the exception of emergency room. And that's why you find so many undocumented migrants in emergency rooms, because legally that's the only place they can go. But as we know, in addition to federal laws, there are state and local ordinances and laws and ordinances that have been passed in many cities. This is the graph, right? Outcome of local restrictive policies, proposals by quarter. So it's not just federal law that's creating pressure on immigrants, but state laws, often that parallel federal laws, almost the same law, but at the state level, to give it more power, or ordinances that say landlords cannot rent to unauthorized immigrants, or things like that, right? So what I'm trying to create is the image of an environment where many immigrants live with their U.S.-born children or U.S.-born relatives, citizens, where they feel a lot of stress and pressure because of the new environment of restrictive enforcement. Oop, I don't know what I did here. Can somebody help me? One of these buttons.
Need a millennial.
I need a, is there someone under 8 years old here? Thank you. Okay, so here's like IRA, this new law passed in '96, and it's been like the largest immigration law passed between now and '96. Other laws, but they're minor compared to IRA, right? And so it increased and facilitated deportations because it increased the number of reasons why immigrants could be deported. Crimes that were committed before for which immigrants could not be committed, or not even crimes, offenses, now became deportable, okay? And it made most detention arrests, it made detention mandatory. So we began to see detention centers, which attracted for-profit industry. A lot of our detention centers are administered by private companies who sell stock on Wall Street, and they're doing very well, okay? And here's something affecting elderly. It made deportations retroactive to before '96. So in '96, Congress changes and increases the number of reasons for which people could be deported. And it said, and if you committed this act even before this law, like 20 years ago, you're still deportable, retroactive. And in fact, the first wave of deportations include many, or a good number of elderly who back in the 60s or back in the 70s committed a crime. Let's say they got caught with a joint of marijuana, and they were given 1 year suspended sentence, right? And they did a plea deal. Said, you know, go ahead and plead guilty, and you can go back to work on Monday. And that's what their lawyers got them. It sounded like a good deal at the time. But then when IRA passes, that's a deportable offense. Even though you did it 20 years ago, you're deportable. And I was involved in a 5-city study in Texas with a team looking at the impact of this new law. And we found families who told us these stories about their grandfathers that had been deported for something that happened in the 70s, you know. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, came into their houses at 4:30 in the morning. They put everybody on the floor, and they took the old man, they said. You know, so this is the type of environment that I'm talking about. IRA also had Section 287G, which authorized state and local police to be deputized as immigration inspectors after receiving training in an ICE training center in South Carolina. So now we have the local police acting, and it made it difficult, a lot more difficult to cancel deportations, right? So once you have an order of deportation, you're almost sure to be gone. And then it created a bigger budget for more border patrol, and then a budget to create a border fence or wall. I don't know what it is. We used to call it in the US, Mr. Trump is the first one to call it a wall. But in Mexico, they always called it a wall, muro, right? And so, you know, when I was talking to people said, well, yeah, the elderly can be affected, but they're such a small number. I mean, the real problem is with the young people that may be suffering from it. But then I started looking at what are the sources of older immigrants in this country? Let's say, especially undocumented. So I'm looking at data from the Pew Research Center said in the year 2000, 35% of unauthorized migrants in the U.S. had been, only 35% of unauthorized migrants had been here for more than 10 or more years. But by the year 2010, 62% of unauthorized migrants had been in the U.S. for 10 plus years, which means that 11.1 or 0.3 million undocumented immigrant population is aging. It's also part of the aging process. And so they're contributing to the growth or the reproduction of older immigrant age cohorts. Migration Policy Institute tells us that there are about 6% of the 11.1 million undocumented immigrants are age 55 and over, which is about 663,600, right? And so that the undocumented population is aging and creating more undocumented older migrants. I looked at the MIF data set, and I looked at how many were surveyed coming to the U.S. age 50 and older, and for 2011 that was over 87,000, and then for 2013 that was about 74,000. So while the net effect of Mexican migration is now zero or negative, there are more people going back to Mexico than are coming in from Mexico. They're still coming in from Mexico, okay? Just not as much as they're going back to. And a chunk of those coming in are migrants age 50 and older. And I found that when you hit the age cohort 55 to 60, it's predominantly women who are the older migrants who are coming over. And so just real data sources for my paper. I look at the MIF, which we heard about this morning. I also found the 1989 legalized population survey of when the U.S. government gave amnesty in 1986, IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act, signed by President Reagan, which gave amnesty to about 3 million migrants, mainly from Mexico. And of course, there's the Pew Research Center data. That's also, it's public data, and other data sources are my own studies and projects with other researchers looking at undocumented status and stress, right? Looking at restrictive enforcement and the fracturing of families and communities here and abroad. So those are like my data sources. And so here I'm looking, there's a table here of fear and stress in immigrant environments. And this comes from the Pew. They have a question. How much do you worry that you, a family member, or a close friend will be deported? And they've asked this question for 4 years now, most recently 2013. And a lot, we find that native-born Latinos, 15% said they worry a lot. Now, why would a native-born Latino person worry about deportation? They're citizens. The only people you cannot deport are citizens, right? Well, they may be married to an immigrant, right? Or they have relations, family relations to immigrants who are not citizens, or you live in a household where somebody is an immigrant and can be deported. Foreign-born, if you look at like the year 2008, foreign-born, over half said they worried a lot, or some. That's almost 70%, right? What this data shows is that there's a lot of worrying among immigrants, right? And I just don't get the sense from statistics. I've been in the communities in Houston, Austin, and even in San Antonio, right, talking to migrants and what they do to avoid detection, right, by ICE or Border Patrol, and what have we. So the fear and worry has been documented by Pew and other researchers. It's out there. Then I went back to that data and I took out all respondents to the survey age 50 and older, right? And foreign born, and then I divided them. Those would become citizens and those would still not citizens, right? Worry a lot or some, that's still a large number. Older immigrants would become citizens. 41% of the survey said that they worry a lot or some, right? But 59% said worry not much or not at all, right? Citizenship. But then when you look at the non-citizens, worry a lot or some, it's 53% of older immigrants who are non-citizens, right? And then worry not at all or some would be 40%. That's still a big number, and I'm wondering who are those 40% who don't worry, right? Maybe they're kind of old and they said, que será, man, you know. It's just like, I come from a Mexican-American family. We have those views about life is inevitable. You take what it comes, right? You feel you can't control the environment, then don't resist it. Go with it. This is too small for you to see, but we did a survey in Austin, Houston, and Galveston in the late 1990s, and looking at what we call a culture-related stress. We had many variables: gender, legal status, family status. And then we had a question, fear of deportation. And if you could see this graph or this chart, what you would see is that fear of deportation is closely correlated or explains a lot of the variance for what we call extrafamilial stress. That means things that immigrants do outside the family, going to work, navigating institutions, whatever, right? And so when people express fear or stress about doing things outside the home, the family, that there was a strong correlation with fear of deportation. That affects people's behavior. I'll give you an example. One family I interviewed, young couple with two little girls, they're undocumented. They said the husband and wife never travel outside the house together. That way, if one of them is arrested and deported, the other one stays behind. So they figure out a strategy for the security of their children, right? So those are some of the stressors that we find. The increased risk of deportation, and I have here age distribution of deportees, deported migrants, and I put in red those that are 50 or older, right? And you can see that we're not talking of a small number. We're talking of, almost 15,000 right there. And you even get deportees who are in their 70s, almost 200, So that these people are, just age won't save you, right? The only thing that'll save you is U.S. citizenship and a good lawyer or something like that, right? An expensive lawyer, right? You can't do this research without getting to know the immigration lawyers. And they're a great group of people. And then the other risk is that if the older migrant is not deported, someone in the household may be deported who's the income earner. And if you're an older migrant, then maybe you're more of a dependent and not an income earner, right? We just last year published this paper in the journal International Migration that we call Deporting Social Capital. And that's based on a survey we did in El Salvador of 300 deportees. And we found that a big number had been in the US for a long time, had been legal immigrants, and owned homes, had jobs, whatever, and they were deported for some infraction of some immigration law or because of a criminal offense, right? And they were like the main source of linkage to the mainstream. And so when that household lost immigrants like that, that family becomes vulnerable and they become disconnected from social institutions that can help them. So 20% of our deportee sample of 25% lived in multi-generational households with older members. 70% of those who lived in 5 years or more in the US had older generational members in the household. So the longer that they lived here, the more likely they were to have older migrants as part of their household. And these guys and women, it's mainly guys, about 90% of deportations are guys, because ICE doesn't have enough facilities yet to detain women, but they're building even near San Antonio. And then finally, this thing turned off, so I lost my timekeeper. So restrictions to healthcare, in what ways? Okay, so one of the things that I needed to find out was how many older migrants actually get sick and go to hospitals. So when we talk about healthcare, how much? And so, okay, my time's up for 1 minute, and that's all I need. I needed a sample of undocumented migrants, age distribution and hospitalization, and I found it. When the U.S. gave amnesty to 3 million migrants in '86, they also did a survey of those undocumented, and they found that 8% of all of everyone 50 and older who applied for amnesty had been in hospitals 1 year before amnesty, right? And they asked them, what was your place of care? And the largest response was doctor's office. And women gave family clinics, 11% of the women, okay? Then my final point right here, many of the migrants say we did our survey in Texas said they didn't want to go to clinics or hospitals because they may be reported to Border Patrol down in the border or to ICE. And we all say, well, that's crazy, they're not gonna, come on. Well, guess what? We found Texas public hospitals offering lists to federal officials of Immigration Service of unauthorized immigrants who did not pay their hospital bill, printouts, right? And this article that's there, the New England Journal of Medicine, talks about 800 documented cases of hospital repatriations, hospital deportations. These are hospitals that they have patients, maybe undocumented, they're poor, and they have long terminal illnesses or something, and they're just there and they don't know what to do because nobody's gonna pay for that. So with or without their consent, they take those patients, they put them on a plane and send them back to Mexico or some other country where they're from, right? Anyway, I hope I did something to help describe to you the environment of fear that many migrants live in today, especially older migrants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nestor. Indeed, it's quite impressive. In these last 20 years, we have seen a major shift in this legal framework and with very, very important social consequences. And I'm certain that we will have many questions coming from the floor, but maybe we will proceed first with the next presentation before beginning with the question and answer session. Please, this is Dr. Terrence Hill from the University of Arizona at Tucson, talking about the religious involvement and biological function in Mexico. Terrence?
Thank you. Before I begin, I wanted to encourage the poster presenters that are coming in late. You can set up your poster through those doors to the right. So if you just come in late, feel free to set up your poster. Okay, I'm going to talk about something that we don't usually talk about at this conference, and that is the association between religion and health. I want to thank Veronica for talking about the institutions of religion earlier as kind of an introduction. Before I begin, though, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Sunshine Road from University of Louisville and Chris Ellison, who is just down the road at UTSA in the Department of Sociology. Over the past 30 years, numerous studies have shown that religious involvement, as indicated, variously indicated by observable feelings, beliefs, activities, and experiences in relation to spiritual, divine, and supernatural entities, tends to favor health and longevity across the life course. And when I say numerous studies, I'm talking about thousands of studies being conducted all across the United States, and pretty much any health outcome you can think of, mortality risk, physical health, mental health, health behaviors, has been examined, and you see a pretty consistent evidence, cross-sectional data, longitudinal data. Over the past 15 years, researchers have extended the religion and health literature to biomarkers, or indicators of biological functioning. Biological functioning typically refers to the concept of allostatic load, which is code for chronic overactivity of the physiological systems that we usually think about, the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, cardiovascular system, metabolic systems, and immune systems. Studies show that religious involvement is associated with favorable levels across a range of biological markers: body mass index, blood pressure, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, white blood cells, Epstein-Barr virus. These are indicators of immune function. And then CNS, epinephrine, cortisol, stress hormones, and then combined overall allostatic load. In this year alone, we've seen 2 studies that have shown that religiosity in the population is correlated with longer telomeres. So these associations with biomarkers extend to concepts related to molecular aging, biological aging. Why? Why would religiosity promote health in the population? There are lots of conceptual models out there. This is one that I produced a few years ago. Most of the psychosocial resources and health-related behaviors that we care about are reliably linked and consistently linked with indicators of religious involvement. Going back to Emil Durkheim, religious involvement is an integrative force. It facilitates social ties and supportive social relationships and expands our networks. That's what you get from the ritual. Being involved with religion also promotes self-esteem, control beliefs, a sense of meaning and purpose. All of these things kind of translate also into healthier behaviors. The religion itself can prescribe things like heavy alcohol consumption, but providing things like meaning and purpose and social support can actually discourage motivations for pathological health-related behaviors. And so when you start to tally up the social resources, the psychological resources, and the healthy living, you start to see that dump into the body, and you start to see these favorable biological profiles. The end result being better mental health, better physical health, better mortality risk, longer life expectancies. So the questions that we have are, do the apparent health benefits of religious involvement extend beyond the United States? The research I've been talking about is coming from the United States. The specific question that we're interested in, does religious involvement favor healthy biological functioning in Mexico? Why should we care? Why should we care about religion in Mexico? Well, Veronica gave us a good sense of the importance of religious institutions and religious groups, but we all know that the cultural significance of religion in Mexico, the institutional significance of religion in Mexico is really important. When we think about religion, we can think about these things, the cultural practices and the institutions. We can also take a global look and appreciate that Mexico has a really high rate of Catholicism and rank high in Latin America in terms of percent Catholic. As one of the largest Catholic populations in the world, behind Brazil. What type of Catholics are we talking about? In the US, Catholics are relatively moderate on social issues. It seems that the Catholics in Mexico are not as moderate as indicated by these types of social attitudes. Catholics in Mexico are not really supporting allowing Catholics, priests to get married or allow women to become priests. Very small percentage of Catholics in Mexico support those types of convictions. But we know very little about religious attitudes and behaviors in Mexico overall, which is why we need to be thinking about the types of data that Mariana presented and the data sources that she uses, because there's a large untapped resource in terms of understanding the religious context of Mexico. The data set that we'll be using today is the MHAS Mexican Health and Aging Study. This is a large study of adults age 50 and older, and the data that we'll be showing today add to this some information about the religious context of Mexico. In our data set, nearly 40% of the older adults participate in activities organized by their church once or more per week, nearly 40%. And nearly 75%, 74% rate their religion as very important. Right? All these things are telling us how important religion is as a cultural factor, as a cultural force, as an institutional force in Mexico. And really, again, raises the question why we don't talk more about it. So to this point, very few studies have considered the health consequences of religious involvement in Mexico. Nevertheless, there is some evidence to suggest that religious involvement is associated with blood pressure and cholesterol screenings and lower rates of smoking. So there's some evidence, previous studies with the MHOS data have documented that religious older adults in Mexico tend to be getting their screenings and tend to be smoking less. We build on previous research by testing whether religious attendance is associated with healthier biological functioning, as indicated by metabolic functioning. We use a range of indicators: body mass index, waist to hip ratio, cholesterol levels, and glycosylated hemoglobin, which is another indicator of metabolic functioning, cardiovascular function, diastolic, systolic blood pressure, pulse rate, and immune function as indicated by C-reactive protein. And then an index of all of these biomarkers. And here's the data. Most of you are familiar with this data. The MHOS is a national sample of older adults in Mexico. We were fortunate enough in 2012, the principal investigators collected biomarkers, and so we'll be using data from that 2012 wave. And those who had complete information, about 1,802 respondents. Now, it's a rich data source for biomarkers, but there's limited information on religious involvement. We're using in this study the most common indicator in epidemiologic surveys, which is frequency of participation in religious activities, church attendance, that type of thing. And we have 3 levels: never participating, once in a while, and once or more per week. And these are the way that some of you may be wondering how these biomarkers were collected. We have direct measurements of height and weight, waist and hip circumference, cuff measures, blood draws, and as well as blood spots. These are the background variables that are common in the literature that we'll be showing. All the estimates that I show you are adjusted for these background variables. We're going to present different estimation procedures. There's not a consistent strategy for how to code biomarkers in this literature. Some people use the continuous metrics. Some people dichotomize according to the high-risk cutoff, like the top quarter or the high-risk quarter of the distribution. We're going to do both, and then we're going to use negative binomial regression to sum the high-risk dummy variables, so that you have a sense of the count of the number of biological risks that you have within individuals. This is the continuous specification OLS estimates. This is the part where I just told you about how important religion is in Mexico, and now I'm going to tell you how it's not important at all for biological functioning. So, nobody got that? Okay, sorry. Okay, so nobody got that. Null results across the board for diastolic, systolic, pulse. There's some evidence that people who participate once or more per week have higher levels of HbA1c, which is not what you would expect. But you do see some initial evidence of lower levels of CRP. Not much going on with cholesterol, body mass index, or waist dip ratio, or the summary index of allostatic load. Now, when we look at the dichotomous outcomes, that is, those distributions cut at the high-risk quarter of the distribution, again, we see null patterns across the board, with the exception of CRP. We had a marginal significance in the continuous estimation, but in this estimation we see a lower odds of being in the high-risk quarter of the distribution for CRP among those who participate once a week or more. And we see some nonlinear relationships with cholesterol level, and then we see some evidence of people who participate having lower odds of having high cholesterol and being in the high quarter of the body mass index. So to summarize, for 83% of our focal tests, participation in religious activities was unrelated to biological functioning in the elderly Mexican population. This general pattern was observed across specifications for diastolic and systolic blood pressure, pulse, waist-to-hip ratio, and overall allostatic load. For 14% of our focal test, participation in religious activities favored healthier biological functioning. This pattern was observed across multiple specifications for C-reactive protein, an indicator of immune function, total cholesterol, and body mass index. We also observed some evidence to suggest that participation in religious activities can be associated with poorer biological functioning. This pattern applied to the continuous specification of HbA1c, which is an indicator of glucose metabolism and metabolic functioning. For the most part, our findings are inconsistent with previous research conducted in the United States. The question is why? We believe that our results speak to the importance of context, which is a good thing given the theme of this conference. To the extent that religious involvement is high and religious composition is relatively homogeneous in Mexico, older adults may be heavily influenced by the general norms and expectations of their moral communities. These community effects could effectively dilute the observable role of individual variations in religious involvement, which is why we're not seeing the types of effects that we consistently see in the United States. Limitations, there are several limitations to this project. The single item measure of religious participation is a major concern. People have measurement concerns about what does church attendance mean when you're trying to measure religious involvement. Obviously, any of the effects of religious involvement that we've observed here are conservative because the single item lacks reliability and content validity. There are a number of other ways to measure religious involvement that go beyond simple participation in religious activities, and so we need replication with rich data sources that not only have great biomarker measurements like the MHOS, but also good religion measures. There's also there is some limitations in the biomarkers assessed by the MHOS in the sense that there's no indication of the autonomic nervous system like adrenaline, noradrenaline, or the HB axis, principally things like cortisol, measures like cortisol that we would like to see. So when you talk about a concept like allostatic load, you'd like to touch on all the major physiological systems that are implicated in the stress response, but these are missing. So for all we know, there could be some effects possibly in Mexico. We need research to look at that. And then finally, cross-sectional data. The best criticism of the religion and health literature is health selection, especially when your focal predictor variable is a behavior that requires health in the first place. It takes a certain degree of health, mental health, cognitive health, physical health, to go to church regularly and to be regularly involved in religious activities. So is religion promoting health, or are people who are more religious healthier in the first place? We don't know. Although I would say that our null findings are actually kind of some relief to this idea that health selection is not probably driving our results, or we would see more significant effects. And we only really see something for something like immune function, right? We're not seeing this for high blood pressure, or cholesterol, or any of those things. Future directions. We need to examine mechanisms linking religious participation with immune function, in this case CRP and cholesterol. We need to examine subgroup variations by gender, urban, rural, et cetera, other conditioning factors. We're looking at religion and health in the aggregate. Perhaps there are theoretically relevant sub-communities in the Mexican population that religion may be especially beneficial for. We also need to think about using more of the MHAS data. Even though we only have biomarkers in 2012, we do have measures of religious involvement in earlier waves, and if we're able to successfully merge earlier waves, we can maybe take an index or maybe examine trajectories of religious involvement across the earlier waves to have a better sense of exposure to religious involvement over the study period and not just be looking at concurrent measures. At the very minimum, it would be helpful to have religion at one point in time and biomarkers at a subsequent point in time to at least highlight some, or to establish some time order. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Terrence. It's a very interesting point of view, and indeed it raises many questions that we may be able to address during the discussion. But we could begin, maybe beginning with the first presentation by Nestor. Are there any questions related to our first presenter? Yes, please.
In relation to what you were saying about illegals and legals and citizens, that why should they be concerned? They should all be concerned. Everybody should be concerned, really. But they should all be concerned because of the rhetoric that's used for describing these people. It denigrates all of us, not just the illegals. To the point that some people would say, I don't want to appear before this judge because he's a Mexican judge. It affects all of us. It denigrates all of us.
Right.
When your son or daughter is going for a job interview, it might be in the mind of that recruiter.
Mm-hmm.
Is the guy a criminal or a sex offender or a drug trafficker?
Right.
I would just like to see what your reaction to that is.
No, I completely agree that, there's, especially in some areas that where immigration emerged very rapidly, like in the Deep South, where they were not used to having a lot of, like, Mexicans. This can occur everywhere, right? But in some of those places, they think that all Latinos are undocumented or illegal, whatever. And so, yeah, I think it's like one size fits all, right? Like one stereotype is used for everyone. So I certainly agree that when people have negative views about certain groups, let's say immigrants, unauthorized, undocumented, that it's possible and maybe probable that they extend that negative and critical view to all people of Latino or Mexican descent. So I agree with you, very much so. Thank you. It does.
Any other question about this first presentation?
I have a comment.
Yes, please.
Please.
The religiosity aspect, the religiosity is changing over time, and we read about it. It's changing in Europe, now the U.S., and perhaps Mexico at some point, and that may or may not be a variable as far as your findings.
Yeah, no, so, someone else was talking about earlier about the increase in evangelicals in Latin America. Yeah, I mean, you still see really high rates of Catholicism, over 80%, but you're definitely seeing these new streams of evangelicals, Pentecostals being spread throughout Latin America, and this could actually be good for the future as Mexico becomes less homogenous in terms of its religious views and religious context. Maybe you'll start to see some clear impact of religious beliefs and behaviors. That's definitely a possibility. At this time, you're right, in Mexico, it's difficult to think about that too much as a variable because there's very little variation in something like religious affiliation, at least, because almost everyone's a Catholic almost. But that's definitely something that we'll be thinking about.
There's another question, and then Bob.
It's more of a comment to American status. Thank you. That Catholicism has been embedded in Mexican culture, in the fabric of Mexican culture. So it's often hard to distinguish what is religious versus what is cultural. And so, and religiosity is one way of measuring a person's affiliation and the way we think of how, quote unquote, religious a person is. But I'd like to argue that even for those who are not religious, they may very well adhere to religious principles because they are so embedded in Mexican culture.
That's the exact point that I was trying to make at the end, why we're not seeing any differences, because you have these really strong moral communities and norms for behavior and things of that nature that because they're so homogenous in the views that individual beliefs and behaviors become less important in that community context. In America, maybe it's a little different because it's more individualistic, and there's more diversity and less. The moral communities are less strong and less pronounced and less coherent. So you may see more of the effects of the individual differences in America than. But I totally agree. I think that's the best theory for why we're not seeing much in Mexico.
Well, thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bob.
Thanks for that. I think, I don't actually want to quibble with your overall findings, but I think that you may need to look at the individual risk factors in a different context than at least I can tell from what you said. For example, cholesterol in older people predicts longer life, actually, and high blood pressure distributions are different in older people and in the oldest old. If you go to church, you might get more infections from all the people you're sitting around and all the respiratory infections, and so your measures of inflammation may go up. So I think these are not, I don't want to seem flip, but I think you're really not necessarily interpreting the risk factors correctly in terms of the implication. Anyway, finally, I may have missed it, but it didn't look like you adjusted for underlying chronic illness, which is going to change a lot of the risk factors and may also bring people to church. So I just think it's a little more complex than you're presenting it, than you might think about some of those things.
Thank you for not quibbling about my results, by the way. Yeah, I totally agree. The biomarker distributions can be unique across different life course segments. That's one reason why we used a multiple specification approach and just didn't just look at the continuous specification. We also looked at the high risk quarter of the distribution. There are also other ways of looking at underactivity of these different biomarkers. We are looking at these biomarkers as outcomes, and we're not at this point interested in their health consequences, although I would say that our coding schemes are consistent with other biomarker studies, not just those interested in religion, but those interested in socioeconomic status. For example, the MacArthur studies use similar coding schemes, so we're pretty confident in our coding schemes. As far as your question about adjusting for pre-existing health issues or underlying chronic conditions, things of that nature, we don't usually predict health with health. Thanks.
So your statement about religious involvement, you're really talking about Eurocentric, Judeo-Christian Catholic / because there's a huge population of indigenous and the indigenous marriage. If you study ethnoanthropology, which is something that would be interesting to plug into this, It's been an issue going on. The fact that Protestantism was brought up, Protestant issue caused a lot of issues after colonization because it separated Mexicans, while Catholicism got involved with the local religions. So there's a lot more to it than that, specifically with taking it away from Eurocentric and to making it Latin American centric, because this is a really white perspective.
Guilty.
Julia?
Thank you. Just a comment. There has been previous studies from England in which they use locus of control. The MHAS also has a scale for locus of control, which is the mastery one has over his destiny, perhaps. So if one has an internal locus of control, means that one person can control his life. And if it has an external locus of control, it means that perhaps destiny, perhaps God. I think it's very interesting, and I don't know, perhaps it could be included in the model and could give part of that answer, that if they don't care or they don't believe that it should care because it will happen anyway because of God.
Yeah, that's a good question. In the U.S., actually, religious involvement is consistently related with stronger control beliefs, which is counterintuitive. And you see that across indicators of control beliefs, the sense of control or mastery, self-control, which is distinct, and also health locus of control. Oftentimes, those psychological dispositions are considered mechanisms or mediators or explanations for why religious people might live a healthier lifestyle, because they actually believe they can control their lives, they believe they can control their health and behaviors, because anything is possible when you believe and a higher power and have a relationship with a higher power. That's like the logic, at least, that's been employed. But it's counterintuitive, because usually you would think that religious people would defer and would think that their lives are actually driven by forces external to them. But when you actually measure the control beliefs, the sense of control and or mastery, self-control and or a health locus of control, you see the opposite. But we don't know about Mexico. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So can you comment on how you constructed the variable for total allostatic load? Because you had different pathologic conditions in there, and previous studies have used allostatic load and, I mean, actually both C-reactive protein and allostatic load as markers of chronic stress. So did you weight all the pathologic conditions equally, or did, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we did weight them equally. So we had two specifications for allostatic load. One was just a mean index of all the continuous natural biomarkers, the way they exist in nature, natural, continuous. And then we did the high-risk cutoff where for each biomarker we did a dummy specification where if you were in the high-risk quarter of the distribution, you received a 1. And if you were not in the high-risk quarter, you received a 0. And then we summed across those dummies, and that's where we use the count model to predict the count of number of high-risk biomarkers. But you're right, that's another strategy that's very sophisticated, doing like a latent variable approach maybe, where you don't assume that each biomarker has an equal weight, and that is another possibility as we're developing this paper that is very sophisticated.
Very interesting paper.
Thanks, Fernando.
This one.
Thank you.
That's it. No. So I guess what you're showing is I'm not so concerned about Mexico being, like largely majority or largely Catholic as a problem for your study, but in fact kind of an interesting experiment, because if you cannot, knowing that there's some limitations that you acknowledge in the data. That you may not be able to do anything about, even with other studies in Mexico, I'm not sure about that, but that also have health information. But I wonder if you can vary the setting though. I mean, because a lot of the mechanisms that you showed and some of your other work with social support, for instance, shows how, I mean, you're arguing for a social aspect of religion, not about, how the message of salvation, for instance, might give you some peace of mind. And again, you don't have stress related measures here, but that has good consequences for health. It's a social issue, but the way the way Catholicism is organized in many parts of the country, at least especially in urban areas, or at least in many neighborhoods in urban areas, it's not exactly a social organization unit for many people, right? Again, I'm overgeneralizing perhaps, but for some there is, and of course, there might be ways in which you can actually look at settings in which this might be the case, to try to pin down that social support, capital kind of aspect of religion. But yeah, it's fascinating.
That's exactly what we want to do, because we don't want to give up on it, because you're right, this is a very gross analysis because we're looking at the total population, but you're right, Sunshine wants us to be looking urban and rural, and also high migration, non-high migration, more stable communities versus not stable communities. We definitely recognize, for everything I said about how homogenous Mexico is, you're right, there's still plenty of diversity to call in terms of moderation analysis, and we are definitely going to look at that, because we don't want to just settle for nothing, that there's no relationships. We want to make sure that there's no, relationships. But the first thing that I listed on one of those slides was like urban versus rural, and also like high migration, non-high migration. They did a really interesting sampling job also of getting these different areas of Mexico also that we could look within, these different sampling units. But we totally agree, totally agree.
Hi, Terrence. So my first point was just what Fernando said.
Yeah.
So this thing about individual versus social, and probably after some other analysis you find that there is something, but probably here it's more that religion is more also a social thing, social participation, church organizes things, and in Mexico, at least for a Catholic, it's more an individual thing. So probably that could be, but Fernando said that. But already, what I was thinking in terms of variations, you have this longitudinal study. Did you think of sort of doing it by cohort? Because the differences between the ones that are 50, 60, 70, probably there's a difference. And especially because the importance of religion for someone 80 probably is, or 70, probably is very different from those that are 50. So probably you could see something there in terms of, probably for some. And my third question was, did you think of looking at other indicators like cognitive function? Because that has also been sort of linked, and especially in trajectories. Looking at it, I'm thinking of, this is a panel study, longitudinal. And also because if I remember correctly, those biomarkers have not been done in all waves. So it could let you explore for the full sample, because the biomarkers are only for a subsample. So it could let you explore for the full sample, something that you can sort of parallel religious participation with an additional health indicator.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment about the potential age variations. In the U.S., we observe consistent age variations in the benefits or effects of religious involvement. You're totally right that religion can mean different things at different stages of the life course. And that's something we will also consider in addition to the urban-rural, high migration, non-migration. Gender differences also is consistently looked at. I wanted to say something about this. People are acknowledging the social aspects of religious involvement, and I just want to emphasize that's just one mechanism, and I don't want to overemphasize that one because people start to reduce it to that's just social integration or that's just social support, but it is actually more than that, and it's a ritual that actually drives those things. It is not a proxy for those things. It is actually one ritual in our society that actually drives social connectedness and social support. So it's conceptually distinct from a potential mechanism of social ties, social integration, social support, but there are also these these psychological mechanisms like control beliefs or these behavioral mechanisms of healthy living. There's a lot going on there, and your point's well taken that our inferences could be improved if we looked at some of the health outcomes that were at all waves and not just the biological markers. We're being opportunistic a little bit here. We wanted to take advantage of these unique data because it's really hard to find population biomarker data with some measure of religious involvement. But the cognitive functioning is cognitive decline is really important. I actually published a paper a few years back in the Journals of Gerontology with the Hispanic Epis documenting that very thing over time with growth models. It would be interesting to try to replicate that in Mexico. I would actually like to encourage everyone that might be interested in psychosocial factors and population health to be taking apart the MHOS and look at every health outcome. Like I said, I reviewed the literature. I could only find a couple of studies with the MHOS data that looked at health-related behaviors, the screenings for blood pressure and things like smoking. So the cognitive functioning, the mental health, dietary behavior. I mean, there's so many things. There's a world out there. If you just want to grab it, we could do this together.
Well, that's quite interesting, and well, it's taken some time, but we'll still have some minutes if there are more questions. But I wanted to just please go ahead. And
you said that context is important, and your findings clearly showed that context is important. You find things in the U.S. and then you apply it to Mexico, it didn't quite work out. Yet, at the same time, you attribute the non-finding that maybe religiosity is so dominant that everyone adheres to it, whether they go to church or not. Now, take another context. Take East Germany, which I've studied for the last 20 years. Hardly anyone there is religious. Had become a very secular society. Now, that society is very healthy. I don't have the kind of studies that you have in terms of markers and so on, but there's no difference between East and West Germany now in terms of life expectancy, even though West Germany is more religious. So my point or my question to you then is, maybe religion matters in this country, but it's sort of irrelevant in a lot of other countries. So if we don't find something, perhaps we shouldn't say, well, religion is so important and there's a norm that it doesn't matter whether people go to church. Maybe the conclusion would be religion doesn't matter.
Yeah. That's the first research question I had. Do the health benefits of religion extend beyond the United States context? I mean, that is the question. I would love to see data cropping up in every country. And you're right. I don't know specifically about Germany. I've been exposed to some data from Australia, who also has. They're not as religious as either the U.S. or Mexico. And in fact, a surprising percentage of Australia identifies as Jedi Knight when you ask them what their religious affiliation is. And you don't really see an impact of religion in Australia as well. And this raises an interesting question because maybe the religious context could be driving the health benefits in some countries and maybe undermining some of the data in other countries depending on the context and the first thing you said, context matters. Yes, it does. We're just beginning to even think about this, and I came here to be honest with you that there's not much going on in Mexico. I wanted there to be something going on in Mexico. I didn't want to show you null patterns. Well, what?
Maybe it's going on for everybody in
Yeah.
Mexico, right? And if you change and become less religious, and then you see the effect that might be the different direction. So,
Yeah, possibly.
But I wonder if, listening to the discussion, I wonder if we are talking about the potential benefits of religious practices or the potential benefits of spirituality, which is not quite the same. And there is there is a spirituality which is not necessarily linked with a specific religion, this idea of mindfulness, for example, and these practices that can help you deal with stress and with locus of control can be of benefit for health independently of any religious practice that has more related to a culture. In the case of Mexico, we are 100% Guadalupanos, and everybody. but it doesn't mean that we leave this relation in a spiritual with a spiritual meaning of some kind. Would you?
Oh, I agree. That's a limitation in the U.S. as well in terms of looking at people who are spiritual but not religious. In the U.S., most people who say they're religious are also spiritual. There's considerable overlap between religious and spiritual, but there is a significant and growing segment of the population in the U.S. who is spiritual but not religious. They connect with some kind of higher power, but they don't identify with an organized religion. I'm not familiar with that, with what's going on in Mexico because I haven't seen those data. Maybe those attitude data have something about spirituality or that we could get some estimate of that. But I totally agree that we should be looking at organizational, non-organizational, indicators of spirituality that are independent. And really test this idea, are the spirituality measures related to health that aren't necessarily so connected to the social support and to the organizational aspects. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a pure test when you think about it, like, your personal beliefs about a connection to some, supernatural force or something like that. Is that related to these mechanisms and health-related factors independent of the organizational indicators? I think that would be great, yeah.
I was just going to say that a lot of the things that were up there were very close to yoga, and there's been a huge increase. There's been a huge increase of yoga. Hold up. I said a lot of the things about spirituality. Yoga has been an increase in Mexico, and the indigenous things, they're spiritual. And a lot of those things seem to fall under the spirituality, like you were saying, much more than just the religious effects, because the more you spoke about it, the more I thought that's what, the blood pressure lowering, the what did he say? The ritual of it. There's a lot of that going on that wasn't there when I first started traveling there.
Yes, we definitely need more research on yoga.
Maybe one last question.
I want to ask something after her.
Okay.
So I was wondering whether actually you don't have enough, like the group is too homogeneous. And so...
Good point.
So if they share, so it's almost like you have two things going on. So one is that these biomarkers may be defined or characterized by the genetic component. And you don't have, so religiousness does not offer enough variation, like it's not enough of a variation to move, in a statistically significant way, the biomarkers to show the effect. So that if you had a more heterogeneous group, it's almost like saying the statement would be religiousness or attendance to church, given, different baselines and different characteristics of these biomarkers is protective or not. But I think like you would have to have a little bit more variation on like the group, on the biomarkers themselves, so that religious shows to be protective or not. Does that make a little more?
You're saying there's no variation in our biomarkers?
Well, is there? So, but yeah, if you were to show that, is there a lot?
It's a population. I mean, it's a population-based sample. It's not like a clinical sample where there might be no variation. This is a population-based sample. We have people that are educated, not educated, rich and poor, and women and men, and older and younger. People who are religious. There's variation in the religious variables. What we're not getting at is the point that was made earlier about the culture, which is something that is an aggregate phenomenon that is above and beyond, the individual beliefs and practices that we're not accounting for in our analysis. As far as the genetic thing, every health outcome has a genetic component. Every health outcome, but it's just a component, and there are actually very few biomarkers or diseases that we care about as leading causes of death that are purely driven by genetics. Those are, something like Mendelian disease or something like that. I will just say this religion health literature also includes religion as an aspect of the environment that interacts with genetics. And so, I never, think about genes as being kind of, just the sole cause of some biomarker to the exclusion of any social cultural factors. I don't think that way.
No, I don't think they would be exclusive. I was thinking more in terms of like whether the genetics would be, so there is association like blood pressure, for instance, at the levels. And so if the levels are not changing that much, whether that was a reason for you not finding enough variation.
Well, I mean,
or that the actually it's not that it wasn't statistically significant, it's just that
yeah.
you didn't have that.
No, that's definitely a possibility, but I mean, Sunshine, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's variability in our biomarkers. Okay, that's what I thought, yeah.
Okay. I think there was another.
It was me.
Oh, yes, Miguel.
Okay, my question is on the notion of your limitations.
Yeah.
Your one measurement was religious, right? It was religion. So how
Participation.
about- yeah, participation. So
Yeah.
how about not strengthening
Yeah.
that measurement by incorporating, measurements of faith and belief?
Yeah.
As you were saying, your spirituality
Yeah.
is in the same notion of faith. So why not include those type of measures to strengthen that measurement?
Exactly. There is several people in this room, maybe everybody in this room has a concern of just putting everything on this religious participation. Dr. Gutierrez was asking me before I did my presentation, what does it mean? What does religious participation mean by itself? Unfortunately, we're limited to what's available in this data set, but that's ideal. What you're saying is ideal. These results, because we're limited to a single measure, which lacks reliability, all of our statistics are biased down now, have less power. These are all conservative underestimates of the effect of religious involvement because we only have one measure. If we had these other measures and we could have an index or look at multiple dimensions of religion and spirituality, we may be able to see more. And that's always a concern when you have a bunch of null findings. Is that null finding real or is it a measurement artifact? Because of your exact concerns, that it's overly limited to this one measure. I will say this, religious participation is correlated with every known measure of religious involvement. It is the strongest measure in the study of religion, if the empirical study of religion, right? So, and it's the most common measure of religious involvement. So it is a valid measure. It's just not reliable and or content valid when you think about the broader concept of religious involvement.
Well, taking account of the discussion, and then no doubt this is a whole field of research open for our interest now, and we will try to build upon this discussion to find more research questions and a new way to interrogate our databases. So thank you so much for participating so enthusiastically in this roundtable, and now we wait for you at the poster session after 15 minutes. Thank you.